So this is our Three Sisters garden here on the land. It's just a small one, kind of for experimental practices. And the Three Sisters garden is a really old style of gardening that's been done in the Northeast and throughout America in different forms, North and South America. And it's a really good garden, especially if you are somewhat nomadic, if you're not staying at the garden all the time, because it works with, the plants work with each other really well, and they kind of take care of themselves. Like once you get it established, it takes care of itself. So when I was younger especially, and moving more, this was my main gardening style. Now I don't do it as much because I'm living here, so I just do a little to experiment and continue to understand. So you can see there's these mounds here. We have 5 mounds and then these pathways in between. So each mound is where the agriculture happens, where the planting happens, and then in between the plants will fill the spaces, and it's also a space to walk. So the mounds is where we put all of our compost and things, and then where we walk and compress the soil and try to keep the weeds down a little bit. So these mounds is just the soil here, which is a pretty sandy soil, but then we have added compost. We've added a little bit of fish parts. We haven't got that many fish parts. Traditionally, putting fish into the beds is one of the main ways that they were fertilized, but we have added a little bit of fish that we've gotten from the lake. And then otherwise, the compost that we have is composted cows and food that the cows eat. If a cow dies on my parents' farm, we compost the whole thing. So it's a similar sort of idea of using all the nutrients of the animal and putting it into the beds. It makes for very rich soil. We also have ash, and we have biochar, we have charcoal, which we add to the beds too over time. With the biochar, you don't want to necessarily put it right into the bed when it's fresh. You want to add compost tea, or you want to pee on it, or let it sit near a compost pile for a while so it can absorb the nutrients, because it's sort of spongy in that way. It can actually pull nutrients from your garden at first if it hasn't been charged. So yeah, these mounds, they're not huge mounds. They're big enough that if you're kind of on the edge, you can easily reach to the center. So they could be a little bit bigger. I wouldn't do them smaller, and maybe I would make them a little bigger, but I like this size. So the way that I will do it is, the Three Sisters is corn, beans, and squash. And there is other plants that were cultivated in the Northeast and that would be in these gardens, but some of the main staple foods is corn, beans, and squash. And some of the benefits of corn, beans, and squash is that the corn and the beans dry out very easily and can be stored throughout the winter and even for more than a year if you have extra. And the squash also stores for a long time, just as it is fresh, and can be cut and dried, and the seeds can be dried and stored for a long time. So they're crops that you're growing in the summer, but you're not really eating until late summer into the fall, and especially in the winter is really what these crops were for. Because in the summer there's so much food to forage and wild plants growing and lots of fish to eat. So the first thing that I plant is the corn, because you want the corn to be able to grow up and get away from the beans and squash. Otherwise they can get tackled too early and not be able to succeed. So I plant corn around now. If you watch the leaves of the trees, a lot of the trees are pretty leafed out, and especially the oak trees. If you watch oak tree leaves or ash trees, those trees leaf out slower. And people say when the leaf of the oak is as big as a squirrel's ear, that's the time to plant corn. And we only have a few oaks here, but their leaves are that size or bigger at this point. So it's a good time that, the spring kind of jumped right into summer pretty quick. So you plant the corn, you wait it, let it come up a little bit, and then you can plant your beans and squash. And so the corn grows up, and then you plant a bean variety in amongst the corn. Maybe a corn plant didn't come up, or you have a little space, and you plant your beans, and ideally they're a short vining bean, so they can grow up the corn or live near the base of the corn. And the beans fix nitrogen for the corn, which needs a lot of nitrogen. And the corn creates somewhat of a support and safety for the beans to grow up and be supported so they don't fall over onto the ground and the beans rot. And then the squash, you plant on the outer edge of it. And the squash will fill in the space and keep the moisture in the soil by creating shade, and also kind of create a protective barrier that's harder for animals to get in. The squash has kind of thorns on its stem, which make it a little less comfortable for animals to come in, and kind of fill in that space, keep the weeds down. So you plant those all together, and they work really well together, and then you can, once they're established, you can just kind of let them go and then come back in the fall when it's all ready to harvest. So I'll plant the beans first today. So I have this package of beans, which is called Callus Flint. It's an Abenaki variety, but it's widely available. It's an old variety that just one family was keeping in Vermont for some time. And they weren't Abenaki, but they'd been given the seeds from Abenaki families, and they were still keeping it and tending it, and knew a lot about the stories of it. And now it's, you know, High Mowing sells it, a lot of companies sell it, but it's a good Abenaki variety. It's pretty strong. It has these two colors, which is pretty cool, but if you plant a red, you don't necessarily get a red, or you plant a yellow, you don't necessarily get a yellow. But when the ears come up, it'll be either red or yellow. And they say that back in the day when they would have these husking parties, like everybody would come together because people grew a lot of corn and they'd all husk the corn together. And the red ones are more rare than the yellow. So if you husked a red one, you could take a break and kiss your sweetie. That's one of the stories people say. So we'll plant the corn. In these mounds, I won't plant too much corn. I'll do about nine plants, something like that. This is the smallest circle. You know, you could do another pattern too. You could do, you know, like something like that, so they're kind of offset a little bit, little diamond shaped, however you want. It's good for the corn to be somewhat tight together. They support each other, and also because they're wind pollinated, you wouldn't necessarily just want one corn. If each mound only had one corn, you wouldn't have very good pollination. For each mound, I would want at least 5. But I think 9 will be good. Some won't come up, and the pollination will be supported. So I just put them in, not very deep. A lot of seeds, they say, around twice their own depth, or their own size. So if the corn's that big, you know, I put it maybe up to the digit of my finger. You know, I'm not very particular. Corn is pretty strong. If I had denser soil, then, you know, maybe I would be a little more careful with it, how deep I plant it. But because this soil is so fluffy, and then I just kind of brush it over and wait for the rain. Right now I'm planting this really dry, but it's supposed to have thunderstorms on Friday. And so I'm trying to get a lot of my seeds in. And I won't water, because if I start watering, the seeds will become dependent on me watering. So I won't water. I'll let them sit there, and they'll wait for the natural rain, which will soak much better, and then they'll be in a natural cycle and won't be dependent on me as much. Yeah, so that's the 3 sisters. There's a whole bunch of knowledge in learning the spacing and how the plants grow together, and each variety will grow differently together. So there is a lot of learning. It's a fun garden. It's low maintenance. You can learn a lot of history from it. It's a beautiful technique that's been passed on through time. Sustainable technique for the land. Yeah, if you do have questions, you can feel free to email, send any questions in. Yeah, happy gardening, be well.